you who don't know, in North County, San Diego. We are a Shin Buddhist temple. We operate under the Buddhist Churches of America. And we are delighted that you've taken the time to join us today online in our Buddhist Community Gathering. This is our third annual Buddhist Community Gathering. The concept that we have come up with is to have thought leaders from a diverse Buddhist practices, including our own Shin Buddhist practice, come together, dialogue about how Buddhism helps us deal with the challenges of our contemporary lives. In 2019, we had our first event back pre-pandemic, and we gathered in Vista at our Hondo, and our topic was Buddhist practice in our everyday life. Second year was 2020, deep into the pandemic, and our topic was how Buddhists cope in times of turmoil and cultivate change through compassionate action. Kind of a sign of the times back then. And today, our topic is transforming the barriers of race and racism, building solidarity among communities. Once again, we are very privileged to have three inspired and very inspiring Buddhist thought leaders with us, and they'll be speaking with us today. Reverend Duncan Williams from the Soto Zen tradition, Reverend Myokei Caine-Barrett from the Nichiren tradition, and Reverend Blayne Higa from our own Shin Buddhist tradition. The format today is that each speaker will share with us for about 20 minutes. After that, we will take a short 5-minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to have a panel discussion where each of our speakers will interact with each other. And that panel will be moderated by Casey Marume of Vista Buddhist Temple. A quick few housekeeping announcements. As you may have heard already, that the session is going to be recorded or is being recorded. If you're more comfortable, feel free to turn off your video. Please remain muted. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to the panel, and we have time to pull that off, go to the chat box, look for Casey Marume's name. If you just drop down under the everyone thing, there's Casey will be there. And if you pose that question to her, we will try to get it addressed during the panel discussion. And now I would like to introduce Terry Omori, who is from Vista Buddhist Temple. She is the president-elect of Buddhist Churches of America, and she's going to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Ricky, our fearless leader here at the Vista Buddhist Temple, our temple president. Let's see. It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce the first presenter for today's gathering. Reverend Blayne Higa is the resident minister of the Kona Honganji Buddhist Temple on the Big Island of Hawaii. Born and raised in Hilo, Hawaii, Reverend Higa's spiritual journey led him down the path to Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. He holds a Master of Divinity degree from the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California, with a focus on Shin Buddhist ministry and chaplaincy. Reverend Higa received Tokudo, the first level of ordination, in 2012, and Kyoshi certification in 2018 from the Jodo Shinshu Honganji Ha in Kyoto, Japan. Before entering ministry, Reverend Higa spent over 17 years in state government and nonprofit fundraising. Now here's a fun fact. During lockdown last year, Reverend Higa got inspired to cook more from watching Midnight Diner, a Japanese television series on Netflix. So, Reverend Higa, I'm curious. So what's your special dish? When Reverend Higa is not cooking, watching Midnight Diner, or taking care of his Sangha, he finds time to manage his blog, Hearing the Light. When you have the chance, I encourage you to check it out. Just go to BlayneHiga.com, where you will find Reverend Higa sharing his thoughts on Dharma and life. And now we are in for a wonderful Dharma treat from Reverend Blayne Higa.
Thank you so much, Terry. So, aloha, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you from my home here in Kealakekua on the west side of the Big Island of Hawaii. I would like to acknowledge that Hawaii is an indigenous space whose original people are today identified as Native Hawaiians. I further recognize that generations of indigenous Hawaiians and their knowledge systems shaped Hawaii in a sustainable way that allows me to enjoy her gifts today. For this, I am truly and profoundly grateful. I'm honored to be included in this panel of distinguished Dharma teachers as we explore how we can transform the barriers of race and racism by going to the Buddha's teachings for guidance. A few days ago, I came across a memory on my Facebook feed. It was a post reflecting on a New York Times video story of how one of their editors at the time wrote an open letter to a woman who had yelled at him and his family to go back to China with an expletive. This open letter ran on the front page of the Times and invited other Asian Americans to share their own experiences with racial prejudice, all labeled with the hashtag, "This is 2016. Thousands of people came forward to share similar stories of being otherized as Asian Americans in our country. My post reflected on my time as an undergraduate student in Oregon in the mid-90s, and how I had similar experiences of my own over 20 years earlier. Having been born and raised in Hawaii, I grew up in a diverse community where the color of my skin and my heritage were not unusual. However, living on the mainland is where I came to understand my status as a minority and as an other in America. Living on the mainland taught me how I was hyphenated, how my ancestry had to be qualified. I wasn't just Japanese, like in Hawaii, but rather I was Japanese American. Like many Asian Americans, I got the dreaded question, "Wow, your English is amazing. Where did you learn to speak so well?" And I would respond, "Oh, I'm from Hawaii." And to that, I would get blank stares. And eventually, the other dreaded questions being from the islands. "Did you get here by boat? Do you live in grass shacks? Do you have grocery stores? What kind of money do you use?" While I did not necessarily detect malice or ill intent by these questions, the sheer ignorance of difference was astounding. It didn't matter that I participated in speech and debate all through high school, and that I received a scholarship to compete for the college team. It also didn't matter I was double major in English and speech communication. What mattered was how I looked and what people assumed by the color of my skin. Being one of only a handful of Asian American students on campus, many of us became friends as we commiserated about the lack of diversity and how we shared similar experiences regarding race. We eventually formed the first Asian American student group on campus to celebrate our heritage by building community together. We were Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, Christian, Buddhists, all seeking a common refuge from being the other. Within our diverse little community, we discovered solidarity, friendship, and healing. That was circa 1994. Now, flash forward to 2016, and then to our present day. Doesn't it seem like we have not progressed very much in the last 3 decades? And it seems like things have just gotten worse. So, what lessons can we bring forward to help us transform the barriers of race and racism and to heal our brokenness? In Buddhism, we often describe the world we're living in as a burning house because we are trapped by the fires of old age, sickness, and death. We can also understand this burning house to mean the world where suffering exists. We know from our experience over the past several years that there is much suffering. The world is burning quite literally in some places, like the Amazon rainforest and the Western United States, due to our changing climate. However, the world is also burning with the poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance, from the demonization of immigrants to hate crimes against Asian Americans, to systemic racism and white supremacy, to an armed insurrection on our nation's capital, to the polarization of our responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. We find ourselves with so many fires to quench. Buddhism teaches us that suffering occurs when we cling to the notion of wanting life to be fixed, independent, and the way we want it to be. However, despite this wish, our interconnected world is undergoing constant change, and we often have little control over what is happening. The ongoing pandemic has brought us face to face with these fundamental truths of impermanence and interdependence. The Buddha offers powerful medicine for healing our suffering. The Dharma teaches us how to become true and real human beings who live with compassion for self and for others. In the Jodo Shinshu tradition, we use the term ondobo ondogyo, or fellow traveler, to describe members of our Sangha. Each of us is a friend and a guide to the other, and we walk together as equals within the compassionate embrace of Amida Buddha. When we see ourselves in this way, we can break down the barriers that keep us separated, and we come to know how connected and interdependent we truly are. This understanding of this radical equality comes from the 48 vows of Amida Buddha. In particular, the third vow states, if when I attain Buddhahood, the humans and devas in my land should not all be the color of genuine gold, may I not attain the perfect enlightenment. This does not mean a superficial sameness that erases diversity, but rather it speaks to an inner spiritual quality that is affirmed by the promise of universal awakening that is made possible by Amida. Our diversity is celebrated in the Pure Land. The Amida Sutra describes how in the Pure Land there are lotus flowers that shine with a beautiful inner radiance. Just as blue flowers give off blue light, Yellow flowers give off yellow light, red flowers give off red light, and white flowers give off white light. Each of us, in our uniqueness, is exquisite, wonderful, fragrant, and pure. The land of perfect bliss is filled with such splendor and adornments. We are spiritually affirmed and encouraged to be who we are in our full humanness. The Dharma teaches us how to become true and real human beings in this life. And in Shin Buddhism, we rely upon Amida Buddha's vow of compassion, expressed as the name Namo Amida Butsu, working in our lives. Each of us is embraced and affirmed just as we are. It is because we equally receive this activity of love and compassion that we are all fellow travelers along this path of life. Shinran Shonin believed that Amida's great vow of universal compassion does not discriminate between noble and humble, priest or layperson, man or woman, young or old, or any other category that would separate or divide us. That each of us receives Namo Amida Butsu freely and equally because we are enough. That our humble and imperfect lives are truly worthy of being sustained, supported, and embraced by dynamic wisdom and compassion. What an amazing gift it is to live with this knowledge that we are never alone. What an amazing gift it is to receive unconditional love just for being ourselves. It is this acceptance which transforms and heals and gives us hope. I believe Amida's vow is also our vow, our highest aspiration in life. The Bodhisattva's aspiration to nourish and to liberate all beings is the ultimate example of how we should strive to live. This vow is our constant companion and guide in life. The living vow takes root and flourishes in the very soil of our imperfect lives. In the Pure Land path, our ordinary daily life is our practice hall. There is a place of true learning that exists within each of us. This is where the seeds of the Dharma are planted, nurtured, and bloomed. Isn't the living Dharma something we encounter every single day? And aren't we responsible for learning and embodying the Buddha's teachings in all that we do? We have real problems that need to be addressed. We have the difficult task of mending ourselves, our communities, and our nation. This process will be uncomfortable and sometimes painful. But if we move forward together with compassion, empathy, and respect, we can and we will heal. The current head, this current spiritual head of the Nishi Honganji, Gomonshu Kojun Otani, expresses the essentials of Shin Buddhism and how the Buddha's teachings can transform and heal our brokenness. He says the following: living with the Dharma as my guide softens my rigid heart and mind. Gratitude for the gift of life I have received frees me from becoming lost in greed and anger, and allows me to share a warm smile and to speak gentle words. Sharing in the joy and sadness of others, I shall strive to live each day to its fullest. Living the Nembutsu path leads to a life of spiritual transformation in which our hearts break open to the suffering of others, and we naturally begin to embody the living Dharma in all that we do. Can you imagine how different our lives and our world could be if we simply would allow the Buddha's spiritual medicine to work? This is the remarkable life of universal awakening promised by the Buddha and actualized within Sangha. This is why a good spiritual friendship is the whole, the entirety of our path, of our journey together as fellow travelers. May the light of all-inclusive wisdom and all-embracing compassion guide our thoughts, our words, and our actions as we journey along this difficult path of healing. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda Butsu. Namanda Butsu. Namanda Butsu. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Higa, for getting us started today. I appreciate your thoughts on how we're fellow travelers on this path, and I look forward to hearing some more about that later in the session. Our next guest is Myokei Caine-Barrett, resident priest of the Myokei Buddhist Temple in Houston, Texas. Within the Nichiren Buddhist order, she is the first woman of Japanese and African American descent. Myokei is the only ordained Western woman and the first female bishop of the Nichiren Buddhist Order of North America. Her writings have been published in a variety of magazines and newspapers, including Tricycle and Lion's Roar. And they are also featured in the book, The Hidden Lamp, Stories from 25 Centuries of Awakened Women. While forging a path of firsts, first woman of color, first Western woman to be ordained in her tradition, Reverend Caine-Barrett's teachings emphasize individuality and educated awareness of barriers to diversity in our sanghas. A particular teaching of hers that struck me is that our first barrier is in ourselves. And with introspection, we can weed out that which prevents compassion and acceptance from happening. Please join me now and welcome Reverend Myokei Caine-Barrett, Shonin.
Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Thank you. Well, I think Blayne said everything, so I don't have anything to really share. I was really struck by the similarity of thought. I am the product of war, the union of two diverse cultures where the hated met and married the other hated. And for some reason, I always tend to think of it as a karmic situation that provided purpose for my life because I was charged with the task of having to figure out how to live, first as an immigrant, second as a mixed race person, and third as partially the enemy, accepted by none and welcomed by few. That otherness that I experienced was not acceptable to Black communities, nor was it acceptable to different Japanese communities. I was educated about Buddhism and life by Japanese war brides, all of whom were similarly situated as my mother, living in a foreign country, living in a country where she was hated, and trying to find a way to navigate their difficulties without the presence of the husbands that brought them here. It's one of the greatest gifts that I received throughout my life that I will treasure forever. One of the things I learned from these women was the incredible strength of character and the incredible power of faith. When we talk about good friends and bad friends, because they're two sides of the same coin, that we have to really look at what it means to have a good friend and what it means to encounter a bad friend. We use the term in the Nichiren tradition, Zenchi Shiki and Akushiki. Zenchi Shiki is the good friend. And when I was looking it up, I found that it was often the death facilitator, or it could be your master teacher, or it could be just a good friend who walks the path of Dharma with you. The Akushiki is the one who diverts you from the path of Dharma. And one of the things I think about is through experience we learn that anything can be a good friend to you. Anything that happens, any person you encounter, any living being you encounter can be a good friend. But it's entirely up to us. How do we view that particular encounter, that particular being, that experience that we've had? And so I learned through my practice to view my existence as a mixed race person, as a good friend, because it was that which led me to study the Dharma, to practice the Dharma, and try to live according to the Dharma. It's not always easy because we tend to look at the things that happen to us and want to commiserate with others or want to spend our time agonizing, maybe even pitying ourselves for having to go through certain experiences. But the beauty of practicing with the notion of all things being our teachers, all things being our good friends, is that we don't get to do that very often, because there's a deeper understanding of what's happening to us and how we have to meet those moments. I had a gift from one of my dogs who was choking on something, and I could not, no matter what I did, I couldn't dislodge what she was choking on. And there was a moment when she looked at me and I felt her say, "That's okay. I'm not afraid." And she slowly passed away. And naturally, I was at a loss. But I also understood at that moment that she was giving me a gift, that I had to acknowledge that acceptance of death was not fearful, that it was something one could walk into openly and without hesitation. And the last look that she gave me was full of love. So it's important for all of us to acknowledge our own attitudes have to be strengthened, have to be directed, and have to be charted on the path of the Dharma. Everything, again, can be our teacher. The person who called me the N-word when I was 10 years old was my teacher, my fourth grade teacher. I had never heard that word before. And naturally, as most kids will do, I knew that I had done something terrible for her to call me that name. Even though I didn't really know what it meant, it was the venom with which it was said that stuck with me all of my life. I never told my parents because I knew if she had to talk to me that way, that if my father knew what I had done, I would be severely punished. And it wasn't until I was 18 years old that I shared that experience with him and watched his pain, because his entire goal was that he would protect his family and especially his children from having to deal with the racism that was around us. But he was powerless against all of it. My best friend in 4th grade happened to be a Chinese girl whose father owned the neighborhood store. And she and I were the only 2 others in the community. So we were always at odds with everyone. These kinds of things are the building blocks of the person that I am today. These are the methods by which all of us become stronger, become more true to who we were meant to be. We all have a Buddha nature, and we all must acknowledge that Buddha nature with the understanding that it is honed, it is shaped by every experience, every person, everything we encounter becomes our teacher, becomes the sculptor of our lives. And the thing to remember, I think too, for us to be good friends to others, is that we take these experiences without shame, without guilt, and accept the teachings that the experiences bring us, because that is what makes us a gateway for others to find the Dharma. When we suffer domestic abuse, racial abuse, any kind of abuse, any experience like that, people who have similar situations will naturally find us because our lives in the Dharma are open. Our lives in the Dharma indicate that there is an opening there for them to find their own true selves, to be able to see how the Dharma can work for them. There's an expression that we often hear in the Nichiren tradition that it's better for 1,000 people to take 1 step than for 1 person to take 1,000 steps. So all of us are necessary in order to heal our world. And just as Blayne said earlier about the different flowers, we have an expression that peach, pear, plum, damson all blossom differently, yet all blossom beautifully. So we all blossom beautifully based upon our experiences. And our embodiment of that experience, of all of those experiences, are reflected to those around us who are seeking ease from their suffering. I can't tell you over the years how many people that I've encountered that have experiences similar to mine. And then within Sangha, we find the Sangha is like a potato barrel, a potato washer. And we're all the potatoes that get thrown in and bump up against each other and knock off the dirt. At the same time, we're knocking off similar dirt with each other, so that we've created a space where 1,000 people can take 1 step and continue to walk together as a Sangha in order to open the door for other thousands of people. When we look at what we know as the 10 realms, from hell to Buddhahood, one of the things that's abundantly clear is that Buddhahood or Buddha nature is present in each of those realms. So even if I'm very angry or in the hell world, much like being in Texas today, there is still the Buddha land, the Buddha world. that even in the midst of suffering, the Buddha is still there. And my understanding has to elevate to that moment of being able to access Buddha nature rather than hell nature. With the understanding that no matter what happens, the Buddha nature, the Buddha is always present in my life, in everyone's life. So even the person who comes at me with hate or anger still has a Buddha nature. And the example of Bodhisattva Jofukyo, or Bodhisattva never despise, is such a great guide for how to walk in the world. To be able to say, I respect you, I'll never despise you, I know you'll be a Buddha someday, because that Buddha seed is there. That's a difficult practice. It's one I've shared with many of the people in my prison congregations, because it's one of the most racially divided spaces one can walk into. But using that practice, I have seen these men become friends across racial lines, across gender lines, across ages, across class, because they begin to recognize each other and respect the Buddha nature within, just as all of us must do. Other principles that come to us is the guiding principle of how we live our lives, come from the Lotus Sutra, where the Buddha says, all living beings are dying of thirst. I will water them. I will save them from suffering. I will give them the pleasure of peace. I am not tired of giving the reign of the Dharma to all living beings. I have no partiality for them, whether they are noble or mean, whether they observe or violate the precepts, whether they live a monastic life or not, whether they have right or wrong views, whether they are clever or dull. I see all living beings equally. I have no partiality for them. There is not this one or that one to me. I transcend love and hatred. I am attached to nothing. I am hindered by nothing. And the Buddha said that he came to this world so we would all know and follow the path of the Bodhisattva. And that I am always thinking, how can I cause all living beings to enter the way and quickly become Buddhas? And those of us who are practicing today can meet this moment by truly living and embodying our Bodhisattva vows. Because if we actually believe what the Buddha said, that all living beings are equal, then we must embody that principle. We must be able to walk out and see the racist, see the misogynist, and accept that he has a Buddha nature, even as he's maybe screaming into our faces. And our gift to the world, to the moment, is what we have gained from our practice, is that we can be the truest of ourselves, the self that is founded and grounded in Buddhahood, that walks the path of a bodhisattva, that is able to see suffering and take it on, and reflect back to the person who is giving hatred, that we can give love and compassion, that we can speak and bow to the Buddha nature within every single being. And as mentioned before, it's not going to be easy. But we are, as Buddhists, I believe, uniquely suited to this moment, because our practice teaches us that the inner journey we undergo is so powerful that we can change the world. And we have all, no matter what our traditions, accepted the charge to change the world, because we wouldn't be here otherwise. So never forget, how can we cause all living beings to enter the unsurpassed way and quickly become Buddhas? Thank you. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo.
Thank you so much, Reverend Myokei. My hand's tired from taking notes. So I will just say, wow, 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 wow. And I've always been really intrigued by the Lotus Sutra and want to study further. The words of to never despise or never disparage are such powerful reminders and practices. And then also just at the end, when you said that we are uniquely situated as Buddhists in this moment, as practitioners in this moment of the inner journey that we take and how difficult it is. I think just speaking those words of understanding, commiserating for a moment that these are very difficult times. And part of the medicine is just being here together today. So I thank you for that. It's my honor to introduce our next speaker and teacher. And before I do that, I would love to acknowledge the land that I'm on right now. It's the stolen land of the Kumeyaay Nation and the Luiseno Nation, which is also known as Northern San Diego, and Sanitas and Vista as well. So it's an honor to welcome and introduce our next teacher, Duncan Ryuken Williams, a Soto Zen priest and also professor of religion and East Asian languages at USC. He's also the director of the Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture at USC. He is someone that I think of as living the spirit of the Dharma and engaged action. His book, American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War, shares his scholarly research about how Japanese Americans helped to transform Buddhism into an American religion, weaving and naming family stories of loss, separation, and incarceration, our American history. So that thread, or sutra, reminds us to be constant, intrepid students of history, because we can't afford to ignore or forget. In 2019, Duncan led a Buddhist memorial of about 25 priests, along with Sudo for Solidarity, to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a memorial ceremony to remember the life of Kanesaburo Oshima, father of 11 from Hawaii, who was shot and killed at Fort Sill, one of 90 Buddhist priests held in that prison camp during World War II, and also there to protest and shed light on the same site slated as the next prison camp for migrant children. Duncan was also instrumental in 2020 to host a national Buddhist memorial ceremony called May We Gather, honoring the lives cut short due to anti-Asian violence and racial and religious animus. If you haven't had a chance to watch May We Gather, I highly recommend it. You can Google it, a gathering of Buddhists across traditions, which is really a unique and beautiful offering and memorial. So it's in these actions, these very real actions, he felt a need to act and to gather, to honor, to remember, and to come together. This is the spirit of the Dharma and engaged action that uplifts and urges us forward. This is the spirit of bodhicitta, a heart-mind of love. Please join me in welcoming Duncan Ryuken Williams Sensei.
Thank you so much, Judy, for such a kind introduction. And well, as Myokei was saying earlier, Reverend Myokei was saying earlier, the two speakers who preceded me, I didn't, nobody told me what they're going to say. So they covered a lot of ground, and I had a prepared set of remarks. And I think I was like, I have to just make up something different because they covered some very important ground. And one of the things I noticed when I visit Jodo Shinshu temples sometimes is that I'm sure this is not a set practice or anybody consciously thinks of it, but I often find when Dharma messages are delivered by BCA and other ministers, there's sometimes like they crack a little bit of a corny joke at the beginning, and sometimes a little bit self-deprecating, and it's kind of like on the line of like not funny, but okay. And so anyway, I thought I would like to start with something. In my, it was mentioned by Judy, I work at a university and also at a temple, and so there's a little kind of like joke going around among professors, which is that if you are a PhD student and you have an important presentation to make, and it's 7 weeks, from the time of the presentation, that's when you start getting focused and ready and, prepared. But if you are an assistant professor and you've already got your PhD and you're in a tenure track, then it's 7 days out that you start getting a little bit ready and nervous. And then if you're a full professor, which I just turned last year, it's 7 minutes prior to the presentation that you start to get focused. And then I was like, you know what? If you're a Zen Buddhist priest, maybe it's actually only 7 seconds that you get before you get ready. That's what I feel like today, following Blayne and Myokei. I have very few seconds, and I need to kind of like figure out what I should say that would not overlap, but still somehow touch on. I think it was wonderful that they shared a little bit of personal history as well as some Dharma perspective. And so I thought maybe I'd like to do that too and try to say something that will kind of resonate or reflect the perspectives that were shared. In my own case, I was born in Japan, and my mother is Japanese, and like father's from UK, but kind of grew up in a world of being in a kind of mixed heritage, mixed. My dad being British, is Anglican, so like we go to St. Albans Church in Roppongi area of Tokyo. Certainly, and my Japanese grandfather, very, very devout. He was Danka Sodai of his temple, and very, very devout Buddhist person. So we go to temple, and sometimes my brother and I, we'd start sentences in English and then end in Japanese and the other way around. And that's the kind of world I kind of grew up in. And I think I was maybe 7 years old when I went to outside of Japan for the first time for a short summer break to meet my British grandparents. And I knew that maybe I was not quite British, even though I have a name like Duncan Williams. And also I don't look that Japanese, like I think my younger brother phenotypically or something inherited all the Japanese genes, and I took all my British ones. So I don't look Japanese, but I think probably between the two of us, I may be a little bit more culturally Japanese or something, because we went to the hotel in London and went up to the 7th floor. And then my parents are like, Duncan, where are your shoes? And apparently I left them at the, ground level. Japanese ryokan, you leave your shoes at the entrance. So that's how un-British I was. And so a few years later, my father was so worried that my English was so bad and, Japanese was much better. So I got sent to a British boarding school. And for like basically I was 13 or 14 years, like kind of junior high school period. And, this is also when I realized after years of not quite fitting in Japan, even though I felt very Japanese, I was like, oh, wow, it's not quite Harry Potter, but it was one of those type of they call it public schools, but it's an elite private school where, bullying and all the hazing and all the kind of things that you can kind of think about was then, filtered through kids writing nip and jap and what, like all these things that I would come to quickly realize that myself and this other kid from Pakistan and another kid from Hong Kong, we were definitely we didn't belong. And so for me, when thinking about this question of barriers of race and racism, I think of myself, but also like my brother. He, unfortunately, when he was 24, I was probably 26 at the time, he took his own life. And he had really hard time, difficulty in Japan, fitting in. He was gay, and at that time, back in the 1990s or so, it was not as well accepted as today. And he himself thought, maybe I can fit in better if I go abroad. And so he lived in the UK, and not that much had changed since my days, of junior high school period when he went. And especially in Manchester, the part of England he was in, today is much better. But back then, they really didn't like Asian people. And I guess sometimes he had feces smeared on his door and lots of experiences like this. And so I wanted to share a little bit of this personal thing because it kind of, it's what motivates or drives me to think about, I couldn't help him in that period. I wasn't quite able. And he even told me, he was ready to take his life, and I couldn't do anything. And I was already ordained as a Buddhist priest, but very novice. I was just young. I ordained when I was 22, so I didn't know what to do. And but somehow Buddhism has served, for me at least, as a kind of refuge. Myokei kind of, I think, alluded to it. This idea of, the middle path, the Buddha Dharma Sangha as a refuge, like this. That truth and liberation is in the middle, in the in-between, in the cracks that between boundaries and hard and rigid identities. And so for me, that was one of the first barriers or gates, as Myokei was saying. There's so many gates or Dharma teachings and teachers that we encounter in our life. So to me, what I think both Blayne and Myokei were saying about kind of Sangha and spiritual friends and how we do things, in life stronger and better in the Dharma when we do it together with other people. We can always do, it is true, we can do it on, there is a time and place for alone practice, for hermitage practice, for, but there is a strength to know that we are not alone, number one, and that we don't have to get through all the barriers alone. And that is one of the beauties of Buddhism, that says it's not just the example of the Buddha or the teachings of the Buddha, but the Sangha. That's why it's one of our three treasures. It's so important to do it together. And Myokei kind of alluded to it about the potatoes. Suzuki Roshi used to famously talk about that if you're in the Zen monastery, in one of the sections of the monastery is called the Tenzoryo, or the monastic kitchen duties. And when you're in the Tenzoryo, when you're a young monk, you are trying to do things, very properly and so on. So if you're on like cleaning some vegetables, for example, potatoes or something, you take this little spuds out and clean one by one. But the older monks, they know what they're doing. So they just put all the potatoes in a big bucket. It's a little cold, but you kind of rub the potatoes together and then it becomes clean. And that's Sangha, right? That's our rubbing up against each other and helping each other become clean, letting go of things that are unnecessary. And a lot of times, and this is the reference to Buddha nature, a lot of times it's not about trying to become a Buddha or trying to do something to cause something. It's actually a lot more about letting go. And so what reminded me of today's two previous is Zen Master Dogen's Genjo Koan. In that text, he says about 4 or 5 stanzas in the verses, and he says, first verse is, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. And to me, that's a very resonated. I need to figure out who I am. Like, that's a pretty good Buddhist question. But the second line is, to study the self is to forget the self. It means to let go of any preconceptions about who we think we are. Right? And the third line is, to forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. And in classical Japanese or classical Chinese, 10,000 just means, it's just a big number. So it just means everything. So everything actualizes us. We are interlinked with everything. And then the next line is, to be actualized by 10,000 things is to drop off the body and mind of oneself and others, and to leave no traces of awakening. So dropping off, shinjin, datsuraku, body and mind, just dropping it off, we enter a world of the jewel net of Indra. We are this, Reverend Blayne mentioned about the lights in the Pure Land. Beautiful, individual, it's like these jewels in the net, right? We're kind of individuals, and yet we're, polished in such a way that we're like a jewel and like a mirror, and you can see everyone inside of us and us inside of everyone. And coming into that world requires letting go. And so there's something powerful about that. And then both the previous speaker, I feel, alluded to this idea of like leaving no one out. I think Myokei talked about it in terms of Buddha nature, right? And even the Ichantakas, I think the Lotus Sutra, no one is left out of the concept of Buddha nature. So it gives us a huge challenge. The Shiguseigan, the 4 great bodhisattvas, the first line says, Shujo Muhen Seigando, sentient beings are innumerable, and yet we vow to liberate all. What an ambitious and profound, amazing path that we are undertaking as fellow Buddhist, people. And so one of the things I try to reflect on is that sometimes these big challenges, the big barriers, sometimes it is true we can, in 1 second, transform something. In our Buddhist lineage, we have 2 great philosophical traditions. One is Madhyamaka, which is the lineage that says, let's look at something deeply and see it for what it really is. And it's an analysis and a breakdown, and see that things like race is actually not a real thing. It's made up by us human beings. It's completely artificial, and with the boundaries of things like nation and race and whatever, we make it up, and it may have some heuristic value of some kind or another. But for us Buddhists, we don't care about that. We just care, is whatever thing we're making up helpful for us to liberate ourselves, to alleviate suffering of ourselves? And so that's one thing. And then the other main medicine that we have in our Buddhist heritage is the Yogacara tradition, and the tradition of sometimes they call it mind only or consciousness only, or the idea of that our minds is capable, is so powerful that it creates the worlds we inhabit and envision. And that's the world of imagination. To be able to create a world such as imagining a Pure Land with all those colors, somebody had to imagine that. It's a powerful medicine of our tradition. And so we can see clearly what artificial ways we've constructed things like race, supremacy, separateness, etc. But we can also imagine worlds where we can all let that go. So that's the power of our Buddhist heritage, is we have lots of tools, lots of resources to help us with these different barriers. I guess the final thing I'm going to say is, and this is something, you know, Judy and I share, you know, we have a mutual friend in common, Larry Ward, who wrote a wonderful book about America's racial karma. And I've been reflecting a lot about that. I only became a US citizen, you know, now that I've been in the US here for almost 34 years and 33 years after I first landed in the, and Blayne, I want to ask you later where you went to college. I went to a small liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon called Reed College. And I had never visited America before. I landed when I was 17 years old in Portland. And anyway, I had one kind of vision that I would learn when I got there about, there's an NBA basketball team called the Portland Trailblazers. And there's this kind of story of America, which is about trailblazing West, and our rival college across the river was called Lewis and Clark College. It's like these pioneers who brought civilization and Christianity and civilized the nation and moved it. So that was kind of my introduction to what is America. But when I became a citizen just last year and got to vote for the first time and exercise my civic responsibilities and so forth. And, you know, I had to let go of my Japanese passport and nationality. I reflected quite a bit about this question of immigration and who belongs and who doesn't. Judy mentioned what's happening at the southern border, but it also made me think of like the Chinese Exclusion Act, one of the first federal, you know, immigration laws that said one group of people are just not welcome in America due to their race and religion. They were called the heathen Chinese, you know, unacceptable racially and unassimilable religiously. And that kind of vision, a singular vision, a supremacist vision of America, was what I kind of understood as one kind of American story. But Larry Ward and other people I've really respected have a theory of America that says that some of these issues around race is not just about one's privatized, you know, stereotypes or biases or something like that. It's things that we inherit as a collective, and that it's sometimes both the hurts as well as the things that are the medicines can be transmitted over multiple generations. And some of these things, you know, it's today's things of race and racism. Something like racism, it didn't just form in one day. It's a kind of like a structure that was formed over multiple generations. And so the solution sometimes, we may not today in our gathering solve everything, you know, but we may have some perspective that might help, some emotion that might help, some teaching that might help, something as a Sangha that we can do together to crack that wall, find those openings, find the fractures, find the gaps that will let us see through things that seem so rigid and unmovable, and also find some ways to connect with each other. And that's what solidarity, or that's what Sangha means, at least to me. And so with that, let me close and again thank the two, Blayne and Myokei, for their wonderful insights. This is the best I could do in 7 seconds, you know, trying to figure out something else to say that would, you know, touch on what they said, but maybe bring a little bit of Zen Buddhist perspective as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend Williams. I don't think you even needed those 7 seconds. I think off the cuff, you did fantastic. Thank you so much. I have to say, your incredibly personal and vulnerable story about your brother, I think, is a gift that you've imparted on us. And in some ways, we're walking away as good friends with your brother. So all that to say, we are now going to take a short break, give our speakers a chance to rest for a second before we move into our second half of our gathering today. So let me just mention a few things. If you have a question in the, please put it in the chat and direct it to me. The structure and format of the second half is going to be a little bit different. So if you've joined us in our previous gatherings, it's going to feel a little bit different. So I'm not sure if we're going to have time for all questions, but please do send them to me. You'll see my name in the chat as one of the co-hosts. And then I just ask if all of you can be back at your computers around 2:20. We will get started around 2:20. Okay, thank you. Have a nice break. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I have many screens up, so I'm trying to make sure I navigate and have the right things open. I hope you had a nice break, and thanks for joining us in our second half of our gathering. Every year, I feel as though I leave these sessions just feeling so light, that we learn a lot. There's a lot of wisdom imparted, a lot of inspiration. And so I feel very honored to be able to facilitate the next half of our gathering today. So as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm hoping that we'll have some time for question and answer at the end. But what we thought we would do this year is actually let our wonderful Dharma teachers get a chance to engage with each other, and all of us get the gift and opportunity to watch and learn as they dialogue amongst themselves. So I'd like to ask our teachers to unmute themselves, and we're going to spotlight all three for the audience. And I just again want to thank you for your individual perspectives and your Dharma messages today. What I wanted to do was just ask and kick this off by saying, what questions might you have for each other, to open the floor for some unscripted dialogue? And I think we should just get out of the way. Reverend Higa, what college did you go to in Oregon? I feel like that's the first question on the table.
I was going to address that, if I got, I went to Willamette University. So, yep.
Okay, so what questions do you have for each other, based on the discussions today, the messages, anything that you're dying to dig into a little bit deeper?
Well, I have to say I was impressed with your style of delivery, Blayne. It was very passionate. I really enjoyed that, because it's rare to see a Buddhist teacher do that. I've seen folks that are so intellectual, but I love the way you expressed your passion.
Thank you.
Was that learned? Something that was taught to you?
Just, I guess, over the years, through my experiences doing speech and debate, in high school and in college, and just, in life, being able to express and being able to share. I think it's often more powerful, right, when we can offer emotion, to our words, right, and to offer urgency, right, and to share that that joy, right, of the Dharma in our lives, right. So
yeah.
I guess I did want to ask, maybe Myokei, you had talked about how everything can be our teacher, right? And that's absolutely true, right? But the hardest lessons, right, are the ones we learn from those we dislike, or those we have problems with, or those negative and hard, right, experiences, right? So I guess how do you deal with, and how do you better learn from these harder experiences of our lives?
I think early on in my practice, I was taught a concept of number one, Tenju Kyoju, turning poison into medicine, and Hendoku Iyaku, to lessen karmic retribution. And so the very simple understanding I had at the beginning was that everything that happens to me is a result of my karma, because I made the cause to experience these situations. which frankly I thought was no, no. What did I do to deserve all this? But as I gained more experience, I began to understand that, causes and conditions come together, and also that in order to heal from these karmic events, that I would have to have the wherewithal to turn that poison of, the experience of hell or anger or animality that arose within me in response, that it was always up to me to do something about it, to change that negativity into a positive for myself. And I've, over the years, had many experiences where I encountered, I have a bad temper. It's much moderated now. But in the past, when I would encounter people, I would become very enraged. And, I can remember wanting to meet someone in the parking lot to beat them up. Because I also learned to fight at a very young age. My father had me in the boxing ring with my brother when I was 5. So I was ready. But I learned to take it to, in our practice of Gohonzen, to the Buddha and chant about it. And so to take even that negativity to my altar and just scream it out to get rid of it and then begin to understand it. And continuing to do that over the years has taught me that you can take anything, to the Buddha as your father or teacher or sovereign, however you want to look at the Buddha at that moment, and somehow have a door open so you can see. The character Myo in Myoho also means to open the heart, mind, and circumstances. So once you're able to do that, then you could see, okay, causes and conditions. Yes, I was, maybe in the past I was, a white guy who used to beat up black women. So that's how I had to come back as a black woman, on a very simple plane. But to really learn to understand the twists and turns of things that can happen.
Okay, maybe I can follow up a little bit. My wife likes to always joke that I must have been a terrible man in a previous life because I have to put up with all kinds of nonsense. But I'm trying to think about kind of different registers of response. And there's a Zen story about Sasaki Joshi Roshi. He was 13 years old, young novice monk in a monastery, and he had 2 other, I guess, 13-year-olds or something. And the Zen teacher asked, all right, let's have a cup of tea. And I'm going to ask you, young novice monks, one question. Let me know what you think. And he said, how old is the Buddha? And one boy said, I believe the Buddha lived 2,500 years ago. And so he said, I think believes 2,500. Okay, that's a good answer. Second boy said, the Buddha is timeless, it's cosmic, it's beyond time. And that was, well, that's a very interesting, good answer. And then Sasaki Joshiro said, the Buddha is 13. And he was like, that's a Zen answer. And so I kind of want to ask you about what is a Nichiren answer to the question of distance, encounter, and transformation. Because I think what I heard from you in different registers is kind of like 3 different ways to see modern lotus flower, that metaphor that we have in our classical tradition about, on the one hand, this lotus flower is about taking all the difficulties and not the difficult things in life and transcending it. That's what kind of that's the cosmic, timeless kind of answer, right? And then the answer of like, oh, but lotus flowers can't blossom in pristine or sterile water. It needs the mud and the nutrients. It's the kind of interlinked. And then there's the kind of like, it's just one thing, and it's all just moving and transforming all the time. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, when you're faced with somebody who's difficult, annoying, maybe even harmful to you, there might be times when distancing is appropriate and that's needed, or there might be time when encounter becomes a Dharma gate, and unless, you know, it might be good. And there might be a moment when something transformative might happen because you don't see the distinctions go. And so is there a kind of Nichiren Buddhist answer or like style that is preferable to thinking about these kind of questions?
All three. It's similar to what you said. I think that for all of us, isn't it in the moment, you know, that something happens, that your response comes very deeply from within, that you may not know it or understand what's happening, but your entire being tells you, not intellectually, but physically, do this, you know. One of my favorite experiences was being approached by a potential rapist and listening to him tell me what he intended to do. And something happened to me that I said, well, you can maybe be successful and you may harm me a great deal, but never forget, you know, I will haunt you to the end of your days. No matter what you think you're getting away with, I'm going to haunt you to the end of your days. And I must have been like a demon or something because he left, you know. But I always remember that in dangerous situations, there have been times that I just started chanting or just acted like a crazy person, and it worked. And, you know, who knows why it worked. But I also know that when we embody our practice, that it comes out of us in response in ways we may not even recognize. Because sometimes we just have to let that part of us take over. I don't know if that answers your question. So.
Definitely. It's like the Buddha, you know, talking about getting shot and not intellectualizing how to just take the arrow out, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
So Blayne, I had a question for you because, you know, Jodo Shinshu, I feel like one of the challenging things about kind of like, not about how old is the Buddha, but like, where is the Pure Land? You know what I'm saying? Can you maybe expand a little bit more on this question of how to understand what we are doing and what barriers we are transforming and so forth, and its relationship to the concept of Pure Land in your lineage?
Thank you. Oh, you went. So, but you know, I like to think about well, what's fundamental in Shin Buddhism, you know, is this concept, right, of our Wombu nature, our foolish selves, right? And Shinran, in one of his Wasan, his poems, talks about how the ice of our blind passions becomes the water of enlightenment, right? So there is this dynamic alchemy happening, the spiritual alchemy happening within our lives through this spiritual path, right? And it is in those moments of coming to know ourselves, right? Coming to realize our own foolishness. That simultaneously we come to know the working of enlightenment, right? The working of Buddha, the working of the Pure Land, this timeless reality in our lives, right? That it's not one comes before the other, but it's a simultaneous kind of interplay and dynamic realization of my full humanness, right? So I can encounter, well, our ultimate Buddhahood, we believe, won't come till after we leave this mortal world in the Pure Land, right? In the realm of enlightenment. But every moment of our lives, right, living right within Shinjin, within this heart and mind of true and trusting to the Buddha, right, is a life of awakening to self, right? And then the Nembutsu, right, our practice of saying the Nembutsu, right, is an expression of gratitude for that dynamic working, but it's also an emptying, right? Saying the Nembutsu is, like Myokei was talking about, when she says Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, right? There is this letting go, right? There is this giving up, right, of self, right? And in those moments, right, is when we can encounter, right, a glimpse of the Pure Land in our lives, right? Which point us to how we should be, right? Like I mentioned, we are living within the vow of the Buddha. We're living within this dynamic compassion and wisdom that is always unfolding in our life. And so how do we respond, right? How do we reflect? But most of all, how do we respond and live this life, as a practitioner, as a disciple of the Buddha? So I hope that answers
Thank you.
your
Thank you.
question.
What I find really wonderful that I think we rarely see in traditional Buddhist communities is the community among Japanese Buddhists. Because when I first encountered that, from the Shin would come to the Nichiren Temple and do activities together, largely based on around culture, but there was this kind of friendship that really illustrated the true support within communities, and I've never seen that anywhere else. And I think it's starting to become more important to folks these days, that we have to come together across traditions. It doesn't matter what traditions get together, but we all are centered on the fact that we have the three jewels, that we do take certain vows that are similar. And so we can begin from there, which I really love.
Yeah, in Hawaii, we have the Hawaii Buddhist Council, which is based on Oahu, but it's a group of all the Japanese denominations of Buddhism, right? And so every year, this group gets together and holds joint services for Bodhi Day and for Hanamatsuri, right, for the Buddha's birthday. And so it's hosted at various temples. So at the Nichiren Temple, at the Jodo Shinshu Temple, at the Shingon temples. So there is this kind of sense of we are all followers of the Buddha, right? We are all
Right.
followers of the way, right? And we're on this path and this journey together. And so how do we celebrate that which makes us, which joins us and connects us together, right?
I think that's in a way.
So how can we work to spread?
Sorry. Sorry, Myokei.
Go ahead, Duncan.
I was just going to just comment that I think that's one of the things I noticed in coming to the United States is such a pluralism and multiplicity of Buddhist lineages. If we think back, it's not in Kyoto, it's not in Bangkok or Shanghai. It's in places like Los Angeles or many other locations where Theravada, Vajrayana, Mahayana, and every possible shade of lineage is all represented here, and we are like those potatoes that rub up against each other, and learn something. And I think that's what's very kind of beautiful and unique about American Buddhism is that we get a chance to do that, because sometimes it can become a little bit insular in our more traditional formations. And so even doing like this, like Nichiren Zen and Jodo Shinshu, I think that's it's not so common, let's say, in Japan to do forums like this, I think.
Right.
Duncan, I have a question for you. You were mentioning the power of imagination, right? And that and in your discussion, and how does this idea of imagination help us understand the concept of aspiration, right, in Buddhism, right? That we aspire, right? And how does that offer a way of understanding um, our role, right, in the world and our activities in the world?
In our lineage of Buddhism, we often talk about the Buddha as both I should say, exemplar or somebody we emulate as somebody who's kind of the founder of our tradition, but also who set the standard for, and so that's why we cross our legs and sit not under a Bodhi tree, but we take that, assume that posture that the Buddha assumed, because we're like, if it was good enough for the Buddha, it's good enough for us to take that posture. So we view the Buddha as, but then, it's sometimes like, how like if you're in a martial arts kind of dojo or something, like there are like 5th and 6th and 7th, 8th degree black belt or something, like you're like, okay, I can aspire to do, but I don't think I can do that. So sometimes I think we also think of the Buddha as a figure we, respect, venerate, and kind of uphold, not necessarily like, oh, it's a good role model, but more like kind of we say we may not be able to achieve exactly that, but we can honor and respect and revere. So we have that kind of 2 dimensions of like, we can embody everything because we have Buddha nature too, but also the kind of like, but there's a distance, and that kind of thing. And because we have those 2 sides, what role does imagination play? I think it's imagination is the power for us to both envision ourselves as somebody who can aspire to be a Buddha, and also imagine a world where our limitations may not be able to do it, but somehow feel our interlinked nature with the Buddha. So I think it's that, and then it's at the end of the day, though, to me, it's kind of about like, Ryuken was talking about dangerous situation. My wife likes Hong Kong like action movies and stuff like that. So there's I think it's called Red Belt or something. And there's this one scene where the protagonist is up against the wall and there's nowhere to escape, except the only way to escape is to actually not try to escape, but go backwards and up the wall and flip. And it's kind of like you have to have imagination to do that. You know what I mean? And so I think often as Buddhists, we're called to make those kind of moves where it seems like there's no way out. And all we have left is our imagination. And that's the power of it. And so I think that's why Yogacara as a lineage within our Buddhist heritage is powerful, because it says you may have all of your freedoms taken away from you. You may be constrained. You may be in a very difficult, but you still have the Buddha mind left. And it's very powerful, I think. Yeah.
There's an expression that I learned from a Haitian woman, dégagé, which goes to that imagination piece you were mentioning, that where there's no way, we can find a way. And through the power of imagination, I would add. But I always think about that somehow we can find a way. And we've always been able to do that.
Right, and imagination, right, grounded in the Dharma, right, is true resilience. Right?
Yes.
In what we're facing, all the crises, when we're talking about race, talking about the climate, talking about everything, right? There is this, grounding, and we're so fortunate to be able to, right, encounter the Dharma and to be able to practice the way. Right.
And just coming to this as a human being, because Nichiren Chonin always mentioned how difficult it was to be reborn as a human. And while I don't dwell in rebirth and all of that, because nobody I know has been reborn in my experience, but it's not a deal breaker for me that I don't know that experience. I tend to think of that as, from science, I remembered learning that we are reborn fully within our bodies every 7 years, that we have brand new cells and everything. So that is a form of rebirth as well. But that we come to this because we made a choice to be here somewhere along the lines. That we decided this was going to be what we get to do. And all of us did it. So, here we are.
I think maybe that's one of the ways I often think of how to be a little bit less panicked about everything. If we are interlinked and we have multi-generational inheritance of Dharma and inheritance of also difficulty, sometimes we don't need to solve everything all at once. Or even when we solve something small, because we're part of this jewel net of Indra, Blayne, you mentioned, global climate change, economic, difficulty, racial justice, there's so many issues. And sometimes it can feel overwhelming. Like, how can we possibly tackle everything? And because we, as Buddhists, see that they're all interlinked, we tend towards, we have to address everything. But actually, the kind of go in, we have, the mysterious karmic conditions that bring us, as Myokei just said, into this particular reality or into a particular family or a particular community or situation. That's our gate, that's our barrier. But it becomes a gate if we can find the right way through. And so alleviating suffering on this area, if you have a connection to racial justice, maybe that's the area. But if it's global climate change, maybe that's the area. And maybe you can do more than one thing at once, walk and chew gum. But it's also okay sometimes just to do one thing well, because it'll somehow help. And I feel like I got less panicked when it seemed like it's okay to, hone in on a few things that you have a kind of connection to, and then you have some way to maybe help out a little bit.
Right? And we realize we're not alone in this work, right? I think that's the thing. And so we don't have to do it all.
Yeah. But it's kind of like the cracks you were talking about, Duncan, that, we have a particular opening where we can walk through, but it may also be connected to one that somebody else has. And looking around our sanghas, I think we can find other folks with similar cracks that also connect to ours, so that we're building a kind of army of people who can walk different paths but do it together and take care of different areas. And that's why Sangha is so incredibly important to being a Buddhist.
Right. Within Sangha, right, we can truly own, right, our brokenness together, right? Our
Yes.
human together. Right. So
That was the word, brokenness. I like that. Yeah.
So in the musical, oh, sorry, Reverend
Please.
Williams, did you want to go?
No.
I just wanted to say, in the musical Hamilton, there is a song that's about being in the room when it happened. And I feel like we've all been in a virtual room when something has happened magically amongst the three of you, watching this beautiful discussion play out. And in the back of my mind, I keep thinking, I feel like the seeds have been sown for something. I don't know if it's a podcast or like a series of discussions amongst all of you, because this has just been so wonderful to watch play out. So thank you for letting us kind of peek in as you dialogue with each other. So I think we are in a good place to ask maybe one question, which kind of it's an interesting question, and it's tied to the discussion that a few of us were having as we were getting ready for this session, which is, all of you are really active in your respective communities and, various different dimensions of diversity that you all embody and are passionate about. And we're wondering, How has that been received by your sanghas, and how do you navigate that? How are you encouraging and bringing your respective sanghas along as you are trekking new paths, you're breaking down walls, as you were talking about the different cracks? I can sort of visually see all of these, our collective cracks in the wall coming together and aligning to break that wall and break those barriers. So I wonder how you are facilitating that with your respective sanghas. So I open it up for any of you to chime in on, because I suspect you are dealing with certain members of your sangha who might not always align with those paths.
Well, maybe I can start.
Well, I've always been in.
Oh, sorry. Okay, please.
Oh. Okay. I've always been involved with a sangha that's been very diverse. So the experience of being in a sangha that isn't is something new to me. And one of the major issues I have to deal with is around the issue of race. It takes for people who, and about that, because a lot of people do not believe that we should be talking about race in Buddhism. And those people tend to leave the Sangha eventually because it just comes up in conversation. And we have really intense dialogue sometimes about racism and how different people approach it. And some people may make a mistake in how they ask a question of a person that brings out the emotion. We had an incredible discussion one weekend, and someone said, "Oh, I want to learn from you," addressing his comments to a Black woman. And she said to him, "I'm not here to be your textbook." And it could have evolved into a very negative situation, but they continued the dialogue so that he was able to see that it was up to him to do his learning and not expect her to teach him, which is often a very difficult thing to have people talk about. And so some of these things come up from different corners of the Sangha. I have Chinese and Japanese members who are dealing with a different set of issues. And one even said that her upbringing was that Black people weren't any good, nor were Japanese people. And he or she now has a teacher who is both. So she said that was such a gift for her because I showed her something different. So there's very many different ways that it plays out. And mostly the people who leave are white people who find it difficult to remain in the room. And so we just try to keep it going.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'm happy to say a quick word about, how at, for example, the temple I'm affiliated with, which is a Soto Zen temple in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. The temple membership, the temple's been around, it's about to celebrate centenary next year. And so it's been around for some generations, and the membership, as with maybe many Japanese American historic temples, is of a certain kind of certain age and whatever, different things going on. And not everyone shares the same, politics or same, et cetera. And so to be a Buddhist priest in such a circumstance, I think it's quite, how should we say, it's an interesting kind of experiment in how do you find common ground? How can we phrase things or frame things, topics that are of the day and in the news and so forth, in a way that can garner the support and interest and engagement of people from whatever background? Because I think if nothing else, we Buddhists, we have only one main mission, we're here to alleviate suffering. We have many lineages and many ways to go about it. But as long as we can frame it that way, that separating children from their families at the southern border. It shouldn't matter if you're left wing, middle of the road, right wing. That's just not right. And we can have a common ground that creates a suffering that we Buddhists cannot support. I think more recently, I've had some chats with some members around Black reparations. A little bit more charged political, it seems, issue. But in a way, how can we not, consider as a matter of national kind of honor? So I like to try to frame things sometimes in ways that, how should we say, it shouldn't matter what your political background is. If you are a Buddhist person that believes in alleviating suffering, having integrity, then there's certain things that we should just be able to agree on. The exact method and what that may be very diverse and whatever, but some of these things around race and so forth, I think our temples, you can see it in the Dharma schools, you can see it in different places, but even the Japanese American community, it's like 1.3 million people, right? I think the latest census numbers will show us it's been like 35%, 43%. I think it'll show us this time, 2027, that we're just about to break 50% of the Japanese American community is multiracial. And we see it again, as I said, in some segments of our younger population of our temple membership. And so sometimes that helps, is just having kids. I mentioned this only because when I was growing up, my Japanese family is very, very pro-nationalist, Japanese way. And my uncle was a volunteer for the Kamikaze Corps. And on the other side, my British grandfather fought in the Royal Air Force against the Nazi Germany. And they could not imagine why their son and daughter wanted to marry each other. And it was only when the kids were born that a little bit of an opening was created in their minds of people that were stuck because of the violence or whatever that they had witnessed and so on, or their ideology or whatever, that wasn't able to open up. And so I feel opportunities for us Buddhist people to just open gates and find common ground. And if we continue to frame it in terms of this is going to be a minus for suffering and a plus for freedom, very few people will disagree.
Yeah, I think when we ground any discussion, right, on our values, on the Dharma, right? What is the Dharma teaching us? What is the Dharma offering us? A perspective, a way of seeing the world and situations, right? And when we can ground discussions in that, right, politics kind of melt away to some extent, right? Right? But it's a challenge, right? That the Dharma is challenging us to think more broadly. The Dharma is challenging us as an individual, as a human being, to become more fully human, right? To become kinder, to become more compassionate, right? And so with that mind and the understanding of self and our limitations, that opens the door, right, of empathy. That opens the door of coming to better understand the world around us, right? And so, I don't think we should be afraid, right, of these tough conversations, because it is only when we have these conversations that we're pushed to the edge of our comfort is when we learn, right? In Buddhism, we talk about, right, the lotus grows out of the mud, right? A lotus does not grow in clear water. And that's for a real reason, right? The lotus needs the nutrient, it needs the muck of the mud to be able to rise above our conditions, our human life, right? So.
Thank you all so much for answering that question for us. I think we're all going to walk away more enlightened and better Buddhists after this conversation. So we wanted to close with a reading. So if you wouldn't all mind unmuting, our speakers unmuting so that we can read it together, we're going to put on the screen a loving kindness metta meditation. And at the end of this, I ask also our participants, if you'd like to read it, please do so with us. At the end of this meditation, we have in Jodo Shinshu practice something called Namo Amida Butsu at the end. You are more than welcome to join us. You just put your hands together and you can recite Namo Amida Butsu at the end. So with that, I'd ask our speakers to join me in reading our loving kindness metta meditation. First slide, please. Thank you. May all beings be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. May I be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to me. May I live in peace and harmony. May I, my family, be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. May my teacher be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. May my friends be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. May strangers be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. May my enemies be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. May all beings be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you again to all three of you so much for being our wonderful speakers today in our third annual Buddhist Community Gathering. Thank you again. I'm going to pass it on to Ricky.
Wow. I think Judy said that. Well, first of all, again, we want to thank Reverend Myokei, Reverend Blayne, Reverend Duncan. So fortunate to be with you and to hear your messages. Thanks for participating. To all of you, thank you for spending the last few hours with us and helping to build Sangha in this moment. We will be sending you a copy or a link to the copy of this recording. And we're also going to be sending you a survey. So if you would all take a moment to send that back, that would be great. We're looking for 5 stars. Sound like an Uber driver, don't I? I want to thank the committee that put this all together. You've met them, Terry, Judy, Casey, Liat. Thanks for these many months of hard work. Julie, technical help behind the scenes. Thank you very much. I think it all went really smoothly, except for me unmuting my button there. Everything else went great. And for those of you who have had an opportunity to donate to this event, thank you very much. If those of you who care to, you've got 2 pathways or more. One is there's a link in the chat room on the chat box too, and you can copy that and find your way to our donation, or you could go to our website, vbtemple.org, vbtemple.org, and hit the donate button and specify that it's for the Buddhist Community Gathering. Unless you want to join the temple, you could do that too. Same spot. A quick small plug on the way out here for Vista Buddhist Temple. And again, we're in North County, San Diego. On any given Sunday, as they say in football, come join us.